Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Sunday session with HGP, the Humanists of Greater Portland. My name is Anand Atre, and it is my pleasure and privilege to be your MC for today's event, which is being recorded. HGP believes strongly in freedom of speech, but I must state that the views expressed by myself, our reader, today's speaker, HGP members, and our guests at today's meeting are not the official views of the Humanists of Greater Portland. For those who are new to humanism or HGP, humanism represents a progressive way of thinking that is informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. A humanistic approach to life is grounded in reason and our shared humanity, making a humanistic lifestyle one that aligns with social and planetary responsibility. Humanistic values are not based on appeals to external deities. Instead, they are formed when humans use reason and reflect with empathy on our experiences, collective needs, and capacity for flourishing. Paramount among these values is the commitment to uphold the dignity of all human beings. So without further ado, let me turn the proceedings over to our reader for this week, our peerless president, Ann Henderson.
The reading that I've got, I looked at the things that I had, and a lot of them were so very dark. I'm trying to get a little lighter. So E.B. White, who is the author of great Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little and all that, he penned a letter to a man who wrote to him about feeling hopeless, and I think we can all understand that feeling. And this is it. This is the letter. And it was done in 1973. So think about the times then. Dear Mr. Nadeau, as long as there is one upright man, as long as there is one compassionate woman, the contagion may spread and the scene is not desolate. Hope is the thing that is left to us in a bad time. I shall get up Sunday morning and wind the clock as a contribution to order and steadfastness. Sailors have an expression about the weather. They say, the weather is a great bluffer. I guess the same is true of our human society. Things can look dark, then a break shows in the clouds, and all is changed, sometimes rather suddenly. It's quite obvious that the human race has made a queer mess of life on this planet. But as a people, we probably harbor seeds of goodness. You say probably, harbor seeds of goodness that have lain for a long time, waiting to sprout when the conditions are right. Man's curiosity, his relentlessness, his inventiveness, his ingenuity have led him into deep trouble. We can only hope that these same traits will enable him to claw his way out. Hang on to your hat, hang on to your hope, and wind the clock, for tomorrow is another day.
Thank you so much for that reading, Anne. In these times, it's always helpful for all of us to have a reminder that hope is an objectively good thing for us to have. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's session. She is a philosophy lecturer at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington. She is also an activist and a frequently invited expert speaker helping organizations understand hate groups and far-right movements. Her publications include the book Understanding and Countering Fascist Movements from Void to Hope, a co-edited volume on the ethics of researching the far right, and a forthcoming co-edited volume on Christian nationalism. She joins us over Zoom to provide us with greater clarity of the far-right ideologies and movements influencing current policies, including fascism and Christian nationalism. She will also offer us insights into how people are counter-organizing against authoritarian hate, and she will challenge some of our most cherished assumptions about how we should respond to the rise of far-right extremism in America. Please join me in giving a big HGP welcome to Joan Braune.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. And I so wish I could be there in person, but it's tough to get that far. But I'm here in Spokane, Washington. Can you all hear me okay? Excellent. So I've got a little PowerPoint I'll share in a second. But as Anand was saying, I teach at Gonzaga University here in Spokane. And if you know anything about Washington State, we have a similar phenomenon to what you have in Oregon, where you have a sort of Western progressive center, and then you have a lot of Eastern part of the state that's more right-wing survivalist, gun-toting, preparing for the apocalypse. So I did not realize that when I moved up here in 2016, in the lead up to the election of Donald Trump for this job at Gonzaga. And so when I lived in Wisconsin before this, and everyone was like, well, you're going to love Seattle because, you know, it's going to be full of hippies like you, and everyone will be a vegan on a bicycle protesting the war. And then I got to Spokane and there were Nazis. And I had not counted on Nazis. So a number of things kind of brought me into this work. I grew up in an activist family. I've been doing sort of social justice movement work my whole life to some degree. We moved around a lot when I was a kid. And every time we ended up someplace new, we met people by doing activism. So I come by that naturally. When I was in graduate school, I did my dissertation on a man named Erich Fromm. And he was actually part of the American Humanist Association, and I think would consider himself a humanist in several senses of the term. And I was particularly looking at his critique of apocalyptic approaches to politics. So when 2016 happened and Trump was elected, a couple of things happened. First of all, I began to notice a lot of similarity between the ideology of Steve Bannon, who was influential in forming Trump's campaign and early presidency, and this apocalyptic fascist ideology that Erich Fromm was critiquing, that I had been looking at in my dissertation. So I noticed a parallel between how Steve Bannon was looking at time and history and this enthusiasm for this kind of coming battle that will reset history, and fascism. And so I started giving talks around the Eastern Washington community area about warning people about fascism in the early Trump administration. And in the process, I met many people around the region who have been fighting neo-Nazi groups for decades in this area. So I learned about the history of the Aryan Nations compound. I got involved in the Gonzaga Center for the Study of Hate. I learned a lot about on-the-ground anti-fascist activism in this area and its history. And then I got involved in a lot of activism as we saw basically one far-right group after another, either in town or passing through town, helping communities respond to threats and danger and counter-organize proactively. And so I've been doing this research, this kind of work for about 8 or 9 years now. And I want to share with you a number of things that I think might be helpful in terms of how to think about the current moment. Yeah, so my email and website are here if you want to reach me. And this is the book that that Anand was mentioning, or one of the books he was mentioning, this Understanding and Countering Fascist Movements from Void to Hope. And this came out in 2024. And what I was trying to do here, and which I think I'm going to kind of keep the theme of this presentation with you all, is I was trying to advocate for a social movement approach to fighting fascism. And there are many different approaches to fighting fascism, and some are more based on sort of social work style interventions. Some people think this is a problem we can solve with policing and surveillance. I'm coming out of a very social movement based approach, an activist approach to fighting fascism. And the line, fascism is a social movement seeking power, has been important to me and an important thesis in what I do when I talk to community organizations. If fascism is a social movement, not simply a crime problem or a psychological problem, it has to be countered with alternative social movements in response. And the phrasing fascism as a social movement seeking power originally comes from Christian Storm, who's done some great anti-fascist organizing here in the Northwest. My full thesis, my full line, which I'll show you again in a minute, I tell people fascism is a social movement seeking power, and it's always already connected to sources of power. So if we're fighting a social movement seeking power and holding power, we have to have an alternative social movement to counteract it. This is my basic thesis, my basic framework. So this means that, and I think we could talk about this more, but fascism isn't something we're going to solve merely by policing, merely at the polls, merely by making friends or dialoguing with people on the far right, or merely by providing them therapy. There are people that leave these movements. Usually they hit rock bottom first. So there are a lot of narratives you'll hear in public discourse, kind of human interest stories about people who were in neo-Nazi groups, who made a friend who was Jewish or Black or gay and so forth, and it changed their heart. I've looked into these stories, and I think many of the people who share these stories about their reform and their rehabilitation are being sincere, but it's usually vastly oversimplified. There's a sort of genre of the conversion story. And I say conversion story because it often has this kind of Christian flavor to it. Like, I was saved by this encounter with the other. And usually what happened, if you dig into these stories of people leaving really far-right violent groups, is life started really sucking for them first, right? Maybe they went to jail, maybe they lost a job, maybe they couldn't organize because every time they showed up, people shouted at them. And so in many cases, anti-fascist activism helped push people to reevaluate their ideology because they realized life was getting them nowhere. So I'm skeptical of the approach that says we should just dialogue, we should just make friends. There are also a lot of safety issues around that I think people can underestimate. Even if you are a highly privileged individual, a white, straight, Christian man, or whatever the case may be, you will have people around you who could be endangered if you begin forming close friendships with fascists. So I tend to reject this kind of friendship and dialogue approach as the primary solution. I also think under the current administration, but also just in general, policing institutions have very far-right politics. They're highly authoritarian by nature. They will be willing to arrest people who commit the most egregious crimes, but treating fascism as a crime problem rather than a social movement is usually not going to be effective as a primary strategy. And I think we have to be looking at much more than elections right now. So we're fighting a social movement that's organizing on a daily basis. We need to be organizing on a daily basis and not just thinking about particular dates in the future. So I have an organizing framework rather than a dialogue framework. I think we need to out-organize fascists, not befriend them. And we can talk about that further. Some of you may have heard at some point of this idea of the spectrum of allies. This particular term comes from an activist by the name of George Lakey, who has been involved in decades of anti-war and civil rights activism. And this particular image that I've got here, I stole from the Beautiful Trouble website, which is a really fun website if you're kind of thinking about activist tactics. It's beautifultrouble.org. And they have lots of case studies of effective social movement organizing from around the world, different tactics people use, creative methods, and so forth. And the basic idea here is on any given issue, you have people who are actively in opposition to you, you have people who are active as allies with you, right? And then you've got everything in between. So you've got active opposition, then you have passive opposition, the people who disagree with you, but they're not really doing anything about that. And then you have people who are kind of in the middle. Then you have people who agree with you, but they're really not doing anything about it, right? And the idea is you want to move everyone one notch leftward. So you want the active opposition to chill out and be passive opposition. You want the passive opposition to start questioning. You want people that are neutral to start leaning in your favor. And you want people that are passive allies to become active allies. And I think sometimes we get overwhelmed because we start thinking we need to get everyone doing what we're doing. And that, I think, is not the case, right? We need to sort of move everyone a little bit further along this spectrum if we're going to overcome the fascist authoritarian danger that we're currently facing in this country. As I think about where we are at and this spectrum of allies, there are a few things that come to mind for me. In particular, there are a couple of statistics that have been sort of rattling around in my brain. One is a number you may have heard at some point. People are talking a lot about this 3.5% rule. And it comes from an activist named Erica Chenoweth, who studied nonviolent movements around the world. And Erica Chenoweth believes, based on her scholarship, that if you can get 3.5% of the population involved in a movement on a cause, you will then shift things at the government level. That is highly reassuring and encouraging to us. And I think it's not a hard and fast rule, but we can certainly take encouragement from that. I also think, though, it's not enough to think just in terms of who is going to be in the resistance. We have to think about percentages of where people are at on this entire spectrum. So another statistic that I've been haunted by or mulling over the past few years comes from my guy, Eric Fromm. And Eric Fromm, F-R-O-M-M, I should have put him on a slide here. Eric Fromm did a study of the working class in Weimar Germany. So he was trying to figure out, in the lead up to Nazism, where people stood politically. And Fromm was a German Jewish intellectual. He was part of a group called the Frankfurt School, which was a group of Marxist German Jewish intellectuals who fled Nazi Germany for America. And by the way, neo-Nazis have a whole conspiracy theory about how the Frankfurt School secretly runs the world, but we'll set that aside for now. So Fromm was doing a study of the German workers, and he sent out these very detailed surveys. And it was not quantitative, it was qualitative. It was like, tell me how you feel about parenting. Tell me what you think about this. And people would write these detailed responses. And he analyzed people's responses in order to see sort of how authoritarian they were. And what he found was that 15% of the population had these democratic humanistic values. And in fact, that they would stand up to Nazis, that these were people who were ethical, courageous, believed in the dignity and equality of all people. And he found about 10% of the population were hardcore authoritarians, including some people across the political spectrum, from moderate to left, that he felt would then shift and join the Nazis because they had such an authoritarian worldview. Now, on the surface, those odds look good, right? Because you've got a larger percentage of people who are going to fight for their humanistic values than people who want to implement fascism. But what concerned Fromm the most was the enormous majority in between. And as he studied these middle people in the middle of this spectrum, he believed that they would not have the moral and psychological strength to stand up to fascism, and that they would sort of wait to see what happens. They would go with the flow. They would hope things change soon, this kind of thing, right? So there was this passivity and compliance that really frightened Fromm. And I believe that that study is part of why the Frankfurt School got out of Germany so fast, because they realized this is not going to go well. So one of the things we need to be thinking about is, what do we do with this sort of middle group, right? And how do we move ourselves more toward active allies, right? Become more courageous, become more engaged. And how do we think about how to move that middle group? If we spend all or a great deal of our time focused on the active opposition group, that one person in your family who has gone down the QAnon rabbit hole and wants to tell you about the Illuminati all day, I think, are going to lose. I think we're in a really urgent moment, and we have to really move people where we can effectively move them rather than focusing on people at the extreme. I will also say, I just recently listened to a podcast by Ajaris Dixon, She has a wonderful podcast called The Fascism Barometer, which I would love to encourage you to check out. And on the most recent episode of The Fascism Barometer, she interviews Tarso Ramos, who's one of the founders of Political Research Associates, which is also a wonderful group researching the far right. And Tarso Ramos says, in his estimation, and this sounds approximately right to me, we are in a really crucial window of time. So we are in what he calls a 12 to 18-month window. And within that window, what we do is going to determine whether or not we are dealing with a level of authoritarianism under which we can no longer do the kinds of organizing we're doing now. And it's also important to realize in that 12 to 18-month window, it's not just that we're going to see, it's not a sudden thing, right? It's not like, oh, it's been 16 months, now there's martial law and you can't leave your house and you can't say what you want. What we're going to see is a gradual increase in authoritarianism that has to be pushed back against at every turn, right? And maybe not a continual increase if we succeed in mobilizing people effectively, but that is what, if we don't do anything, is going to be happening. So the sooner we do things, the more we can do, and the longer we wait, the less we can do. So there has to be a sense of urgent action. So I've been using this term fascism a lot, and I want to say a couple things about that, because there are people who think this is a meaningless word and not worth using. If you feel that way, that's fine. I'm not going to throw stones about it. There are people that get heavily into debates around terminology on this stuff, and it is what it is. But I do think it's a useful term, and I can tell you a little bit about why. I also think it's important to distinguish three different meanings of the term fascism. So I've got my list of three here. A country might be fascist, like Germany under the Nazis, Franco's Spain, Mussolini's Italy. We could add to this list. And this is often a political science debate. I'm a philosopher. There are people who focus on what are the stages of development and how do you know you're in a fully fascist regime as opposed to one that's just on the way to fully fascist. This is really not my focus, although it's something we're going to have to be thinking about right now, right? So that's number one. So is a country fascist? That's a different question from whether you have some fascists in government. Right? Then number two, and this is where I've focused most of my research and attention. This is what my book about fascist movements is about. People who identify as fascists in some way, or with some ideology that's really just a rebranding of fascism, because it has a lot of different names. It'll, rebrand itself as white nationalism. There are different terminologies. But individuals, groups, movements that are ideologically fascist in their beliefs, right? So people that really hold fascist beliefs. And then number three, I think there is a legitimate use of the word fascist to describe something else that's not people who are consciously fascists and not a country that's fascist. But fascism is more than just meanness or authoritarianism or control, right? So for example, just because someone is wanting certain restrictions on speech does not mean they're automatically a fascist, in my opinion. Just because someone wants to require you to wear a mask in the mall or get a COVID injection does not mean they're a fascist, right? So it's more than just ordering people around. But I do believe there are ways people can participate in fascism without being sort of in the fascist ideology, so to speak. For example, several years ago, there was an image that sort of seared into my mind as an example of this, where there were Border Patrol officers on the border of Mexico on horses with whips, and they were attacking Haitian migrants, right? So you've got so much going on there, right? You've got an image essentially out of slavery. You've got white supremacy, people in a hierarchy above other people attacking Black immigrants, and you've got border politics, right? We're defending a border from these people, right? And if somebody was to say that that is fascism or fascistic, I don't disagree. And I don't think you have to prove that the Border Patrol officers in question are sitting around reading Mein Kampf or sharing Nazi memes online, right? So I think there are like kind of three levels to thinking about what fascism is. So continuing with this movement framework, so if fascism is a movement, it's a social movement seeking power, and it's always already connected to sources of power. So sometimes this is harder to see when it just seems like some goofball in your community with conspiracy theories, or a little crew of skinheads or something. But even those kinds of things are connected in various ways to power. So people have funding, they may have media outlets, they have platforms they organize on, they may have politicians even at the international level that they're in networks with. So it's important to realize that when we encounter fascism, we're encountering a movement, and it's a movement with certain resources. Fascism emerges as a possibility in society because of certain things that are mainstream. So you have to have structures in society and mainstream attitudes that make it possible for this to emerge as a movement. It relies on systemic white supremacy. It relies on misogyny. It relies on ableism. It relies on prejudices that are deeply embedded in society. In order to have this hierarchical worldview, this idea of inequality and worth of some people over others has to already be present. And fascism is also a modern social movement. It emerges under capitalism. So again, fascism is not just meanness. It's a particular phenomenon that emerges in the modern world. And the reason why I think that's important is because it relates to how we respond to crisis. So we are going to encounter increasing ecological crisis and probably increasing economic crisis. And what fascism historically has done is it has stepped in to reinforce and defend capitalism in moments of crisis. It redirects people's anger against the ruling class and towards some minority group that they are told is to blame for the crisis. So it's a way of maintaining power in a kind of crumbling system. And then fascism is enabled by fascist adjacent far-right movements, right? So you may find that there are particular organizations that you wouldn't classify as fascist, but that platform fascists a lot, hang out with fascists a lot. You'll find this in certain fundamentalist Christian spaces that are not explicitly fascist, certain militia groups. There's a kind of bleeding over between explicit fascism and sort of fascist-friendly far-right movements. If we're looking at fascism as an ideology, I don't get into the definitions debate very much, but I would say these tend to be some core beliefs. Number one, that people are naturally unequal, as I was saying, this belief in social hierarchy, that people based on race, gender, ability, or other factors are better or worse than others, and that better or worseness should determine how much power they have. Fascism sees violence as a good in itself, not simply a means to an end. So there are people in other social movements who embrace violence as necessary in certain circumstances. Fascism sees violence as ennobling, as kind of holy and sacred. Violence resets history to where it should be. It brings out the strength and courage of the people destined to rule, etc. Right? So there's a kind of exaltation of violence. If you look at some of the propaganda that's come out recently, one of the most fascist pieces of propaganda I've seen from this administration is that video. I don't know if anybody's seen it, basically advertising the facility in El Salvador. I mean, that was absolutely terrifying, where you see the people being dragged and their heads are held down and their heads are being shaved by the guards in the facility. And you've got rows and rows and rows of police and military vehicles and all the barbed wire and the lights and this kind of celebration of that dehumanization and violence. Very, very bad sign. Use of scapegoating and conspiracy theories. Again, this idea of finding other people to blame. Often this takes the form of anti-Semitism, but it can take a lot of other forms as well. And the politics around anti-Semitism right now is very complicated, right? Because you've got people on the right that are claiming they're defenders of the Jewish people simply because they're pro-Israel, and you've got people on the left being shut down and accused of anti-Semitism for standing up for Palestinian human rights. So that all gets very complicated, and I acknowledge that. But anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are often something you'll see. But conspiracy theories about any group of people, right? Trans people, immigrants, Muslims. The idea is that there's some outsider that's actually running things, and that's why things are going wrong. There's a contempt for democracy and reason. And I think this is really crucial to be watching for right now. We're seeing especially that people in Trump's administration are more openly than ever saying that Trump should be above the law, that Trump should not have to follow the Constitution, that we don't care what the courts say. And there's celebration of kingship, monarchy. There's a lot of this going on in these movements that are in and around the Trump administration. And a contempt for reason in the sense that there's a placing of power above reason, right? So the person in power doesn't really have to justify what they're doing, doesn't have to explain why they're doing it, doesn't have to give facts. They're just they have some sort of special access to the truth because they have this power, because they're the kind of person who should be in power. This is all disgusting, I realize that, right? But this is sort of the framework. And lastly, a view that history is cyclical, that change depends on destruction and violent rebirth. The fancy term is palingenesis, that there's a rebirth process involved. So of making America great again, right? That we have to sort of destroy in order to rebuild. If we look at the Trump administration right now, we see a variety of influences from different far-right ideologies. And I think a few to particularly notice would be Christian nationalism, white nationalism, and then this weird amalgamation of far-right ideologies coming out of Silicon Valley. And I don't know if you've heard this term, TESCREAL. It's a terrible list of words. But essentially, this is all people who have blogs and culty little networks where they get together and talk about their utopian apocalyptic fantasies. So the list of terms is not terribly important. We've got transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. But critics, this is a term come up with by critics of Silicon Valley, tech world, far-right tech bros. It comes from an article by Gebru and Torres called The TESCREAL Bundle. If you want it, I can send it to you. But essentially, all of these different terms unite into a vision of a world where human beings are superseded by technology. And it's a sort of like hyper-modern, post-modern eugenicist model. So there's a lot of enthusiasm about AI, about experiments in communities that would exist outside of the state, little utopian cities, and a lot of enthusiasm about human beings eventually merging in some way with technology, or AI sort of taking over the world for us. So it's a fundamentally anti-humanist philosophy that there's like this superhuman thing that needs to take over, and certain people are going to be destroyed in the process, right? So this is not a belief in human dignity. It's a belief that we need to let some people die so that we can build this kind of super race that will merge with the machines. And so there's overlap between that and these various other ideologies. Christian nationalism, I'll come back to that in a moment, but Christian nationalism means a lot of different things. So you've got Catholic far-right people, you've got like Calvinist, people who have like very literal readings of certain biblical passages about punishing people and stoning them and so on. And you've got like neo-charismatic, Pentecostal people doing like revivals at the Capitol building and so on. It's a mix of all of these things. And then you've got more traditional fascist white nationalist figures like Stephen Miller. All of this is kind of converging right now, where you've got multiple factions, multiple ideologies, disagreements here and there, but a lot of people coming together at the executive level who do not believe in democracy and who believe presidents should be above the law and not subject to it. You'll notice also I use this term state of exception on top of that slide. So that term comes from a legal philosopher, a philosopher of law under the Nazis named Carl Schmitt. And Carl Schmitt has been influential on a lot of people, including actually the Bush administration and the war on terror. And Schmitt believes that you have to have a sovereign, a leader, who is above the law. And to create this scenario, you have to first consolidate executive power. And this is what happened immediately when Trump came into power this time, right? So we had massive firings of anyone in any branch of government or bureaucracy who wasn't the most wacky conspiracy theory addled Trump hardcore loyalist. So across the spectrum, from like Food and Drug Administration to Surgeon General, whatever, like it was like any sort of branch of government you could find, from the people that check our airplanes to the people that check our food to the people that check our roads. Everybody in every branch of government is expected to have this fierce loyalty to simply carrying out the commands of the leader of the executive, and not stopping and asking, is this constitutional? What do the courts say? How have we done it before? You just implement it like a machine, right? So consolidation of executive power, so you have a sovereign that's above the law. The sovereign also, according to Schmitt, has to distinguish between friend and enemy, has to tell the people who's us and who's them. And the them have to be subjected to propaganda, right? So we scapegoat them, we dehumanize them, and eventually this leads to targeting of various kinds. And we're already seeing what we should think of not just as arrests, but as disappearances, because we have people who, under international law, legal conceptions of disappearance, if you cannot be located for 36 hours, like people keep giving you the runaround. They're like, oh, we sent him to New Jersey. We sent him to El Salvador. We sent him to Mexico. We sent him to Tacoma. That's a disappearance, right? It's not maybe a permanent disappearance, but at least temporary disappearance. So we have people being disappeared, in some cases simply for their political statements. And we have, so we already have this happening. And we have targeting of other groups of people besides immigrants. I think one thing to watch is how unhoused people are talked about. And you all in the midst of Portland are probably hearing a lot of dehumanizing rhetoric against the homeless. And this seems like it's becoming a way for the Trump administration to justify sending troops into various cities. So there's this consolidation of executive power, there's the naming of the enemy and dehumanizing of the enemy. And this leads ultimately to the state of exception. So Schmitt says the leader, the sovereign, needs to declare the state of exception. So you essentially declare an emergency situation, and you say, because of the crisis that we're dealing with, whatever crisis you have or manufacture or reference, we can't operate under normal legal conditions. We're going to have to set the Constitution aside. We're going to have to set some of these court decisions aside so that we can restore order. And the police, the military, and non-official organizations, whether that's, Proud Boys or Bikers for Trump or, vigilantes watching the border, can also play a role in these kinds of things. And they're being very blatant about the rhetoric. Like these are a couple of tweets from the White House recently. This was a quote from Napoleon that he who saves his country does not violate any law. Right? And then we've got a depiction that was put out by the White House social media account of Trump as a king, wearing a crown, long live the king. I've been thinking lately about this idea of Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism. So this is my latest research on far-right movements, and I've got a book coming out on it soon. And I think this is maybe not as helpful a category as fascism or white nationalism for a variety of reasons. For one, until fairly recently, almost nobody called themselves a Christian nationalist. There have been Christian nationalists for centuries, right? People who want to exert Christian power in various ways. But it's not a unified social movement. So you've got various people who get lumped into this category. If you look at the scholarship on Christian nationalism, these sociologists, Perry and Whitehead, have done the most sort of empirical work. But they're mapping it according to how people answer questions. Like, do you agree X or yes or no, with questions like, you know, was the United States founded as a Christian nation, this kind of thing, which can be less revealing than the kind of questionnaires that Erich Fromm was doing in Weimar, Germany. The term Christian nationalism gets applied in really wide ways. So I've heard people say it's Christian nationalism if you are singing America the Beautiful in church, or praying at a flagpole, or starting a city council meeting with a prayer. Now, I don't like any of those things, to be clear, right? Like, I think religion and state should be separate, and the symbols should not be blended together. I've got a lot of concerns about all of that. But just because someone sings America the Beautiful in church doesn't mean they want to drive non-Christians out of America, right? So we've got a wide spectrum of things that are being called Christian nationalism. And we're hearing about this as a threat, and it is, but we need to think about what it is that the threat is. It's also, there are white nationalists who are Christian nationalists, but not always. Not all white nationalists who want, if you're a white nationalist, you want a white ethno-state, right? You want America to be all white or all white run and majority white. Some Christian nationalists hold that view, some don't. Some white nationalists are not Christian. In fact, historically in the United States, in the past several decades, the white nationalist movement has not been very Christian, with certain exceptions. The reason why all this is important is not to like excuse Christians, right? Or to say that Christian nationalists are not a problem. It's definitely a problem. The question, I think, is, in order to respond effectively to particular movements, we need to know what those movements believe and what their plans are and how they're going to operate. So a local evangelical church is going to use different tactics from a bunch of Silicon Valley tech bros that are trying to start a town in the neighborhood in the next door to you, and they might operate differently from a neo-Nazi skinhead gang, right? It's a whole gamut of things. But we are seeing a rise across different denominations and different theologies of this very brazen embrace of Christian power, of Christian supremacy, the belief that people in power should only be Christian, that Christianity should be enforced with violence and with state power, at the most dangerous levels of Christian nationalism. And there are people like that, like Pete Hegseth, for example, in Trump's administration. People with these views were very influential in the January 6th coup attempt. And there's increasing mobilization of this. Also, it's important to realize even what draws people into Christian nationalism is a wide gamut. So after you remember the Charlottesville Unite the Right March in 2017? So early on in the first Trump administration, there was this moment where You had these neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville with tiki torches. There was a young woman that was killed, and a number of other people were beaten and harassed. It was a very horrific event, and it looked bad. So there was this kind of enthusiasm going into the event by all of these far-right white nationalists. And then the event looked bad in the media and was kind of chaotic. And so following the Unite the Right Charlottesville event, there was a split in those movements. And some embraced this more violent, separatist, in-your-face, genocidal politics. So you had a rise of accelerationist neo-Nazi groups that were just planning outright, mass shootings and things like that. But you also had a branch of that movement that said, we need to normalize more. We need to enter into mainstream politics. We need to clean up more. We need to run for city council or precinct officer positions in the Republican Party. We need to dial back a little bit this rhetoric and enter into mainstream spaces, be seen as normal. And part of that shift has also been an embrace of Christian symbolism. So there have been people coming out of white nationalist movements adopting the rhetoric of I'm traditional, I'm a Christian, I'm just a Catholic, or I'm just Eastern Orthodox, or I'm just like a very traditional, like liturgically traditional Lutheran, this kind of thing. And in some cases, that's to some degree sincere, but in many cases, it's what we call LARPing. So have you ever seen people at like Renaissance fairs? I don't know if any of you do that thing where you dress up like it's the 1400s and you ride a horse and you fight with fake swords. This is a thing people do. I don't really understand it, but it looks like fun. I've nothing against it. That's called LARPing. It's live action role playing. And so there's a debate about like how many of these Christian nationalists are just LARPing. Not all of them. Clearly, some of them are like very sincere, hardcore, fundamentalist Christians of various denominations, Protestant or otherwise, who really believe the Bible or their theology means they should be in power. But there are also people in these spaces who are obsessed with power, obsessed with violence, obsessed with fascism or similar ideologies, who are playing religious dress up, who are rebranding and using Christianity to organize. And so thinking about that spectrum of sincerity might impact how we counter-organize. For example, you can't talk all of these people out of it with theological debate, because not all of them are there because of theology, right? There's a lot going on with what's drawing people into these kinds of movements. Okay. I was asked to offer optimism and hope. I'm not quite there yet. I'm working on it. So strategically, what should we be doing right now? One of the things I've been reflecting on is that I think we're in a creeping state of exception. So early on in the Trump administration 2.0, my belief and the belief of a lot of people that study fascism was we need to be ready because there's going to be a moment. There's going to be a day when they declare martial law or where they say, like, we're suspending the Constitution, we're canceling the elections, or just like, you cannot say these things, we're going to shoot you, right? Like some sort of like dramatic shift. And that moment may or may not come. Because I think what we're seeing over time is that this is more of a gradual state of exception. So there are populations, there are places, there are people that are being placed into the state of exception, but it's not universal and it's not everywhere in the same way. And states and cities have abilities to resist. So there's talk about blue state soft secession, like just refusing to comply with Trump administration policies. Smaller institutions, et cetera, can resist. And we're seeing particular places being targeted, right? So now we've got troops in DC. There's talk about troops being brought into Chicago. There were Marines brought into California. We can't always predict exactly who or what will be targeted next, and they're attempting to destabilize us that way. But I don't think we can wait for, or like plan around, like we're going to have a general strike when Trump says XYZ, because what's happening instead is like a series of steps, and a slow expansion of the state of exception. So what can we do? We have to build our capacity to resist in multiple ways. We have to build our skill sets, build our allies, build our connections to organizations. We have to resist pressure to compromise our values. So one of the ways fascism operates is it will attempt to find the group of people you are willing to throw under the bus. So there needs to not be that group of people, right? So compromising, like, well, like, let's all come together. If we have to say like trans people can't be in sports, that's okay. Or let's all come together if we have to like put the homeless people in a detention facility, that's okay. Like, let's just all come together. That essentially is letting them win because the way it operates is it attempts to find the group that you would be willing to target, dehumanize, throw under the bus, right? So it's not a moment, in my opinion, where we have to like meet in the middle and hold hands. It's a moment where we have to build a really effective progressive movement against fascism. Now, there's a lot of talk right now about conversations, about dialogue. In the intro that was given, and I was asked first whether I'd be willing to say that I'm going to disrupt your assumptions or something like that, whatever the line was. And I said, yeah, sure. Because I think in faith communities and non-faith communities where people come together and have these kinds of rituals that you do, this is a popular topic, right? This idea that we can learn to speak to one another better. It sounds ethical, it's very kind, right? I'm not against any of that. Like, I'm a teacher. I have to talk across all kinds of lines of difference in my classroom. But I do think there is a difference between dialogue and organizing. So if I am doing dialogue, which I do, like I come from multiple religious and cultural backgrounds, if you're doing, say, Christian Buddhist dialogue, right? You're not trying to convert each other. The whole premise of interfaith dialogue is we're not trying to convert each other. We're trying to understand what we have in common, appreciate one another, build friendship, overcome our divisions, right? So the Christian and the Buddhist say, I don't believe this, but I do share this. And we also have rituals that involve water or whatever, right? That is not, I think, what we need to be doing right now in terms of the far right. What we need to be doing is organizing, and we need to be moving people across the spectrum of allies. So definitely we need to have conversations with people who disagree with us. And those conversations should be about how do we move people? And not the most far right, violent, extreme activists, but how do we move people who are close to where we're at? How do we bring them in? And you don't have to do that aggressively or meanly, but organizing is different from dialogue. It's not just, oh, wow, I see your point. Oh, wow, do you see my point? Isn't it cool we have two different points? Instead, it's like, hey, can I explain why I'm seeing this way? And would you consider that this might be accurate? Would you like to come to an event where we talk more about this? Would you be willing to attend a demonstration and meet more people that hold this view, right? You're bringing them into the view, not just meeting in the middle ground, right? And I think that's an important distinction to be thinking about. We need to be careful that we're not obeying in advance. I recently wrote a little op-ed with a friend here. Our mayor, progressive, liberal, activist history of our mayor here, current mayor here in Spokane. In the 1980s, she was part of the sanctuary movement. She signed a letter saying she was willing to be charged with a felony to protect a Salvadoran family that was hiding in a church. But when we had demonstrations against ICE this summer in Spokane, she declared a state of emergency. And she helped the Trump administration come in and arrest people by giving them the state of exception they wanted. And so we were criticizing her for this. So we have to make sure that we're not buying this narrative of like, ooh, you can keep people safe by going along with these policies, because that might seem like the case in the very, very short run. But as that 12 to 18-month window progresses, we're going to see that as a dangerous loss of rights. So I think resisting wherever we can, continuing to build connections and allies in this work. And then lastly, so I think it's easy to get overwhelmed by the massive amount of bad news. And it's not necessary to follow everything and keep up on everything. If you are the person who just loves to be involved, like you just want to be the person that shows up and helps, that's cool, right? That's a huge need in a social movement, that people come as a warm body to demonstrations, give people rides to events, set up chairs, print up flyers, right? There's just so much like basic legwork that has to happen, from online work to in-person work. It runs the gamut, right? So if you're just a person that likes to get involved and help with things, cool. If you are going to feel overwhelmed by that, or you want to have a more effective, more focused strategy in some way, then I would choose a niche. So you might think about a subculture you belong to, or an institution you belong to, a space in which you operate. And all of us have them. So you, even if it's a hobby you have, like you are in the gardening world, or you are in parenting groups in your town, or you're in drug or alcoholism recovery, or you are in organizations that support veterans, like anything that you do, any hobby that you have is a space typically where fascists are trying to infiltrate or have infiltrated, and where resistance is taking place. So I would encourage people, and if we had more time, I do this exercise sometimes as like a workshop where you list 5 or 6 spaces you're in, whether it's your neighborhood, your faith community, your service organization, the type of books or music you listen to, right? And then you try to figure out what evidence have I seen or heard about? Is there any sort of evidence of fascist infiltration? Of this space being contested? And then how do I find people who are already doing the work to make this space less hospitable to fascism? So I'm just about out of time here. But yeah, so I think seeing where you are at and who's already doing the work, really important. And then start getting ready for needing to support each other in new ways. So you might do a training on support for people arrested by ICE. There are lots of organizations in your community that do various trainings on like bystander intervention, et cetera. Get to know your neighbors, start building some networks so that you know people who can support each other if the systems we've come to rely on as normal operate in ways that we're not accustomed to. All right, so I think I'll stop there. That last line was "Hope is a discipline." It comes from Mariam Kaba, who's an abolitionist activist. So I think my perspective on hope is hope comes from action, right? So when we're in relationship to a goal, working towards that goal, the goal feels different than if it's just an abstract possibility. So I think instead of asking ourselves, can we win? We have to just be doing the work, right? And then we're in relationship to the goal that we're working towards. So thanks so much for having me, and I would love to chat with you.
Thank you so much, Joan, for that edifying presentation, for actually emphasizing the urgency of the situation, the crucial window we happen to be in, the importance of the creeping state of exception, and of course, the emphasis on out-organizing versus befriending. It's now time for the Q&A session. For those of you who are at Friendly House who have questions for Joan, please raise your hands to get a number, and you can ask your question when called upon. For those of you who are on Zoom who have questions, please type your name into the chat. And when I call your name, please unmute your microphone and ask your question. I know many of you will have questions for Joan, so please keep that in mind when it's your turn so that we can cycle through as many of them as possible before we run out of time. Do we have our first question at the Friendly House? Oh, go ahead, Joyce.
I have been active with Indivisible for a long time. We write letters, we demonstrate, we put up banners. But I got a little frustrated with that, and I thought I'm going to pull back from that a little bit and try to work on the message from the Democrats. How did we get what's the word I want? Emaciated so quickly? What happened with the Biden administration? And is there a way to counteract that? Now, is that a waste of time? Should I go back to the banners and the marches and that kind of thing?
I think the question that you're asking yourself is a good one. And one to be talking about with other people. Banners and marching are good. If there are things you can do in your local party, especially, to make it harder for fascism to progress, I think that'd be good. So the more we can do to pressure, I think, some mainstream institutions, the better. So that we're taking a stance of resistance, not waiting it out, like not pulling our punches, picking our battles. Like this is just the time to fight, I think, on every front.
Okay, we'll take our first question on Zoom, which comes from Hank Robb.
Hi, first as a point of personal privilege, please tell Dr. Lane that you met her troublemaking uncle while you were online. Second, it seems to me that the hardcore right-wing fringe is the Republican Party. So perhaps the people to target are the 40%, 40+% of people who didn't vote in the last presidential election. What are your thoughts on the target groups to aim at?
Yeah, I think it's more than party affiliation. I think it's can people be reached with the sense that we are in this crucial moment where democracy and core values of equality are really on the line. So I have encountered Republicans who get that. And, I know, for example, conservative Christian evangelicals who are very anti-Trump. And this, again, is not to say like we should compromise our values. But I do think in terms of getting more people resisting, that's good. And also, I think how people vote is different from sort of whether they're part of a movement. So I do think, there are people who, especially in like poor and rural communities, I don't think we want to just throw everyone out as having potential to reach them if they voted for Trump. I think we have to look at what the level of passion and involvement is and not waste our time on people who are like part of Trumpism as a movement, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, let's take our second question on Zoom, which comes from Brandon. Go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Great lecture, really enjoyed it. I have a ton of questions, but perhaps the one that's most fundamental that I struggle with, growing up, you learn a lot about communism and this and that, but we never really focused on fascism or the Nazi movement as a fascist movement or the significance of Franco Spain persisting and the challenges that brought to everybody really. So anyways, I was curious, do you have a working definition for fascism that I can borrow from you? And is it the same as what Mussolini was talking about? And has the role of industry and capital changed? I've always struggled with trying to articulate what fascism is when I'm having these conversations with people that I think are, movable. They don't really know what it is either, so it's hard to make them scared of it, if you will.
Yeah, and the definitions debate gets really fraught. And so what I've ended up doing there's a piece you might like. It's by Umberto Eco, called Fascism. I'll put that in the chat here. And I take a similar approach to him in the sense that I think instead of having a like a 1 or 2 line definition, we have to kind of take a little bit of a laundry list approach. Like, these are typical characteristics. And so you can feel free. I can share that slide and send it around if you want. Like, I rely a lot on this list of values slide, helping people think about like hierarchy, this one here, right? So thinking about hierarchy, violence, conspiracy theories, contempt for democracy and reason, and the cycle of history. It's not an exhaustive list, but I think it's helpful for people. Let me unshare again, sorry. Did I unshare successfully? No, I didn't. Stop share. So yeah, I think helping people understand that fascism is a movement that's been around a while, and that it's not just general meanness or general authoritarianism.
Okay, great. Let's take question 2 at Friendly.
Is that 3?
I was wondering, you mentioned the approach that they were taking was to move everyone, 1 notch over in that graph. And then you mentioned that our response, and you gave some great pointers, and I think we can act on those, were very specific things about finding targeted populations, etc. Is there any role for trying to move everyone 1 notch the other direction in that graph? That is, it sounds like your response is different than, so it's like a different approach than they're taking. Does it help to just try to counteract their approach specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can, I think you do want to move everyone 1 notch further on the graph. I think the misconception that people have is that we're trying to move everyone to that furthest left quadrant. And that's exhausting and not really very effective ultimately, I think. So I particularly caution people about the active opposition category, because people think you move them a little further along by talking to them. I think that's, especially in a moment right now, not a very good use of our time and energy usually. So I think, instead, you can move them from active to passive opposition by making it really hard to be active opposition. Get their events canceled, whatever you can do to make it harder for them to mobilize. Set boundaries about what is acceptable in spaces, in businesses, kick out fascists who are hanging out in the bar, that kind of thing. But I think trying to move them from active to passive by getting them to doubt themselves and having long conversations, I think we're kind of past that point.
Okay, there's a question on Zoom that I'm just going to read out, and it relates to that TESCREAL slide. They're curious about effective altruism and whether it's just a subset of that group that are eugenicists, or if the whole movement is dangerous, and they're curious to get your thoughts on that.
I'm really not an expert on effective altruism. Yeah, I think it's the stuff that I've read, people are worried about the whole movement. But I don't have a lot on that. I'm sorry.
Okay, let's take question number 3 at Friendly House.
I'd like to ask you, the phrase, or what everyone was saying about democracy is at stake, didn't work in the last election. Trump got in, and as everyone was doing the autopsy on that election, they were saying things like, well, it was the economy and all that sort of stuff. So many people are not there yet. I mean, they're just thinking, they're just doing their jobs and going through. How can we affect that?
Yeah. I think a lot of people are in situations at work or in their daily life that feel very surreal to them. Because I think most people realize something's going on, at least on some like visceral or unconscious level, but everything around them seems to be operating as normal. So I think even naming that in the different spaces you're in can be very, very helpful. Because you will find people who, like I think about the university I'm at, for example, like we talk a good game about social justice, but at an administrative level, we have not been very brave. We have not been confrontational about what our university stands for versus what the Trump administration is doing. There's a lot of like trying to fly under the radar and not get targeted. And because of that strategy in liberal institutions, you have this kind of surreal feeling where people are like, do we recognize what's happening? Are we confronting what's happening? So I really do think there are a lot of people around you who would like to do something. They just need to know that you exist and be invited to do something. And have the safety to name what's happening. So I think being loud and naming what's happening in spaces and pushing liberal institutions to be braver, you'll find, I think we'll find more people. Yeah.
Okay, let's take question number 4 at Friendly House.
They probably had a lot of frustration with like the Biden administration and the Obama administration. But I think we should also hold these people to a consistent standard with how they judge how their government is doing. And if, the Trump administration controls everything about how this country is run and bad things start happening, are we going to give them a free pass? Are they still going to be blaming the same people the MAGA people have been blaming all along?
Yeah.
Right. So there's a risk that as things go bad, people will just say, yeah, it's all because of the immigrants and the trans people and so on. Yeah. I mean, there are people who are going to do that. And so I think it's about reaching more people with the correct narrative. That is how fascism operates. There will be people who will fall for that. And so we need to put out a better narrative and a critical narrative, right? I think the criticism of the Democratic Party that was brought up earlier is right on point, right? So we've had 2 elections now where the sort of moderate, Democrat strategy of I'm not this wacko far right bigot, I'm normal, that strategy didn't work twice in a row, right? And what would have probably worked is something more like the Bernie strategy or even something more left than that. And people were excited about the idea of free healthcare and free college education. And like, yeah, you're going to get backlash on that from the right, but at least you're standing for something, right?
Okay, let's take question number 5 at Friendly House.
Yes, you're having a little ambiguity. You're trying to figure out what the core of fascism is. I think it's the process of power for the sake of power, or to put it operationally, I can't make you obey me, but I can make you wish you had or disappear you. And I think if we're going to try to fight it, we have to either find some way that we can do things so they don't even know about it, or we have to find some way to do things that is playing chess and figuring ahead what they're going to do and how we can counter that. But it's a very hard thing to do. It's just like being in the army or being in prison.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right on both of those things, on both of those tracks. And it is a movement that celebrates power above truth and above reason and so on. I think I advise people against doing only a kind of activism that's not visible to other people. Now, there are people who are in so much danger, of course, that you can't do anything publicly, right? So you need to weigh your level of privilege, your ability to speak publicly, what could happen to you if you do. But many of us still have the ability to say things and organize publicly. And I think if we retreat to the woods to build bunkers for hiding people and to practice shooting guns, we're gonna miss the 12 to 18 month window that Tarsa Ramos is talking about. So I think it's important to not retreat and go underground yet, unless you really individually have to for your own safety. But we need to be preparing for other ways of communicating with each other, other ways of supporting each other. So I think both of those are important. But doing things publicly while we still can, I think, is going to be really crucial.
What do you mean by communicating with other ways? You mean like secretly? That kind of thing? You know, like
Yeah.
What?
I mean, yeah. So, I mean, yes, like I've seen this become a challenge for activist groups, for example, where people are like, can we even have an email list? Should we only be on secret chats? And I think you have to balance the fact that we are in a situation of increased danger. There are some things that have to happen privately and secretly. And there are people that are going to be doing underground things like hiding people or stopping ICE buses or whatever, where you can't just announce it on Instagram. So we have to be getting to know people, thinking about who we can trust, supporting each other, thinking about how we can support each other if we do face some sort of occupation. But getting so fixated on that, that's all we're doing, I think we're going to lose if we do that. So we have to still have like a lot of public facing, mobilizing and organizing in person and publicly.
Let's go to question number 6.
Thank you so much for this presentation. That slide you showed where there, engagement, it made me realize I've gone back more passive. I've stepped back, and I just am curious, how do you keep going? I mean, I think all of us are feeling a bit frightened, recognize what you're saying is the truth. But how do we keep going and not just say, I'm stepping back, it's just too much for me?
I think finding some ways to make it fun, if you can. So nothing burns me out faster than just sitting in meeting after meeting, speaking personally. So if all of the activism you're doing is involved with like sitting through an agenda and then you have to argue about which we're doing next, and then somebody gives the treasurer a report and all of that, that's going to burn you out. So we have to think about, I guess, what gives us life, right? Like, can we do art-based protest? Can we do collective rituals? Are we involving song and dance? Are we coming together over good food? Are we talking about the things that give us meaning in the midst of all of the crisis response? And also, if we're not doing that, the far right's going to provide that to people. So it's not just sort of a selfish thing. It's also, I mean, self-care is good and it's not selfish, but one of the ways the far right recruits is it provides services to people of various kinds. It helps people. Sometimes if you're in a right-wing community, your local Christian nationalist church might be the only thing that helps you out with, babysitting your kids or something. So coming together and supporting each other emotionally and with our material needs can be a radical act, I think.
Humanists of Greater Portland is doing a good job because we're doing those things. That's us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that work.
Question 7 is withdrawn, so we're going to move over to question number 8.
I have my question. is that you haven't mentioned the network, the well-established network of disinformation that the right has. How can that be countered? Oh, yes, what do you suggest?
This is really, really tricky. Yeah, because putting out more left-wing content online is not going to necessarily reach people if they're already in a bubble where the algorithm is just feeding them the same content. We probably have to talk to people in person more. There are people who are open to evidence and there are people who aren't, right? And I think if we focus on the people that are the most ideologically fanatical, again, like we have to kind of cut our losses a little bit, not in terms of their human dignity, not in terms of them being people of worth, but in terms of how we focus our attention. There are people that are just too poisoned by the propaganda. But I don't want to give up on the idea that there are lots of people that are reachable. I mean, a lot of people are just really busy trying to survive. They're working multiple jobs, they got kids, they're poor. They see a headline, they think it's true. So there are people that are reachable through conversation, especially if they see that we're building community, that we're showing up for people in the community, that we're appealing to certain core values. And there's kind of a judgment call there by talking to people, kind of figuring out where people are at and if they're reachable. Okay. Maybe starting some study groups, right? If you have some people that are kind of on the fence and you could have some people over your house and watch a documentary together or read an article together or something like that.
Let's take the next question at Friendly House, which is question 8, I believe. Is that question 8? Question 9 then.
9.
Question 9.
9? Oh, okay. I know there are people in this room who have family members who are in the other camp. I certainly do. And I wonder if you have any suggestions for how to interrelate. We just have made it a point not to talk at all about that. We just talked about what we're going to have for dinner that night. So is there a way to engage? I don't know.
Very tricky. Yeah. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's not safe. Sometimes it's not good for your well-being. If you have, I think I would consider things like, is this a person who values your opinion? Whether or not they feel like they really want to admit that, right? I've seen people just burn themselves out and hurt themselves emotionally by trying to convince their parents of things. I think that is almost always a losing battle because the parent is always going to feel like they know more. There are very rare exceptions where people like move their parents out of these ideologies. You can try if you want, but just be careful of your own well-being. I think one of the most crucial areas where this does have to happen is if you've got kids or young people in your family circle who are looking at things online and getting involved in far-right movements. If you can safely have those conversations, very important, especially because sometimes those young people have never had anyone be interested in their ideas before. And the first people who seem interested happen to be Nazis, right? So having those conversations with young people, if you safely can, bearing in mind that fascism is a social movement, so figuring out how connected they are to it and if it's dangerous before you engage too much. And then also sometimes just being an anchor to reality for some of these people, like if you have people in your social circle that are really deep into conspiracy world, like they think the world's flat, the Illuminati run everything, they're spending hours and hours online thinking about that. Being the person who does just have dinner with them or does just play a game of tennis or go for a walk in the park can help them stay a little bit more to reality. But again, strategy-wise, I don't think this is the population we want to focus on the most.
Let's go to question number 10 from.
Hi, thank you so much. And this has been great. I don't usually speak up at big events like this, but I feel compelled to do so. So the focus on reaching people socially makes sense to me. But I'm concerned about Oregon mail-in election is going to come back and hurt us because we haven't been having conversation about that. And I've been worried about that ever since, I mean, I've been here just a few years. And I also am concerned that the homeless approach, because that's very fraught here, is potentially going to be our weak point locally. Yep. And I feel like as a society, I think a lot of us feel like what's been going on with the homeless situation here hasn't been great too. So it's complicated, but these are two of my local concerns, and any insight you can give to us would be really welcome.
Yeah, thank you. So the first was mail-in voting. And we have that in Washington State too, right? And the concern you have is that this is under attack, right? They're trying to get rid of it. I can't see if she's nodding, but yeah. I think it's a really important thing to fight on because yeah, and Trump has just issued, I think, an executive order, right, against mail-in voting. Not that he can, or against voting machines. I don't know. Like he's going to try to just decree things. And then people are going to have to realize, well, you can't actually just decree how all the voting process works because you're president. So people are going to have to resist. And I think it comes down to like those really like small local positions, right? Like it's really an argument for getting involved in some of those like little local elections, like precinct officer or, you know, whatever officials are involved in election counting, all of that. Because that's what the far right's been doing, right? They've worked their way up through the ranks with these lower level positions. I am also really, really worried that homelessness is going to be the tipping point issue for a lot of places. And for Portland in particular, I think it's really risky. It's easy for people to see it as different as like, oh, it's not like an identity. It's more like, and people will frame it as choice, right? And it's not a choice, right? I mean, like people have agency and they make certain decisions, but nobody really wants to be living in these conditions. So defending the homeless, like, can we help people see that how the civil rights of homeless people affect other people, right? That might be a starting point. And also, can we build some relationships with people that are unhoused and humanize this population for people? One of the most terrifying fascist propaganda pieces I've ever seen was this documentary that was popular several years ago here called Seattle is Dying. And then we had a copycat video that came out in Spokane called something like Spokane is Dying. That wasn't what it was called, it was something else. But there's depiction in the media of homeless people as like language used like they're animals, the police can't handle them, the poor oppressed police officers, the poor oppressed tourists and small business owners are being harmed by these people that are homeless. Pushing back on that propaganda, organizing against efforts to incarcerate or drive out homeless people, like really important, and helping people to see that that's part of like this authoritarian move.
Excellent. It looks as though we're out of questions unless anyone has anything else. Oh, Al has one follow-up.
You talked about the homeless. What I was talking about when I was asking about them making us wish we hadn't done something is if we organize to try to help the homeless, then there are lots of things they can do to either make us look bad or make our city look bad or hurt the homeless in retaliation. How do we get ahead of that kind of thing? And then, you know, they want to make a fight about everything.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, you know your local area better than I do. It's been a huge fight here. There's mutual aid organizing, quite a lot of groups going out and feeding people and meeting with people. We also regularly have homeless people at city council meetings testifying about their situation. There's an organization here that organizes that. Yeah, I don't know the specifics of how to handle it in your situation, and there's going to be retaliation no matter what we do. But helping people understand that this is another way fascism operates and that we have to defend any group that's being targeted, I think is just important.
We have one final question that comes from Zoom, and it comes from Kayin. Go ahead, Kayin.
Hi, my name's Kayin. This is a personal and triggering topic to me, so I'm probably going to sound a little bit, I don't know, I'm not as comfortable with speaking on this, but I'm someone that grew up and was homeless quite a lot as a child, and my father passed away a year ago and was still homeless. And after he died, we found a lot of his journals that were very detailed outlines of how this movement was going to progress when Trump was elected, and critiques of a lot of the horrible ways that people do attempt to organize for the homeless and without first humanizing and connecting to them. And I do think this is one area where there were a lot of questions about when is speaking to your inner circle actually effective and when is it not. And I think homelessness is one topic where that is extremely effective, because I think all of us have people in our inner circles, the majority of our inner circles, that are so disconnected from it. And I think that is an area where you can see, like, the ultimate goal of this whole regime. It's so clear right now. The entire goal is to put all of us in their situation. They're a preview for you. And I think being able to connect, like, that is the preview, that is the system working as it has been for decades. And now they're just trying to expand that effect to the rest of us.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. And I think that's such a good point, that so reaching your own circle of people first about this, and not thinking this is just something we're going to fix with external solutions. And also, we want to be careful what sort of, I think you're hitting on this, like, what kind of charitable kinds of efforts are we engaged in? We need to be cautious about that. Like, we want to be doing solidarity, not sort of like top down, like we've got the solution for you, because there are like far right charities too, right? Like around helping, quote unquote, the homeless, around human trafficking and this kind of thing. Very authoritarian organizing, where people are sort of forced into forced labor and in shelters and all kinds of things. So being mindful of what the far right is doing that's problematic in that regard, and speaking to our own folks and doing solidarity.
So I think let's stop it at that point. Joan did leave her email address on the front of her presentation. So if anyone has any further questions for her, feel free to email her, and I'm sure she's given us a lot of her time already, and she'll give you a response. So let's once again give Joan a bit. So thank you so much.